Hi, this video will tell you about the properties of isosceles and equilateral triangles, and we'll do a couple problems that just have numbers, not really any x's, y's, or algebra. All right, let's start with isosceles triangles. The definition of that is that at least two sides of the triangle are congruent. The word congruent just means equal, but in geometry, when we are talking about shapes being physically equal, we use the word congruent. Also, the other thing to know about the word congruent is that there's actually a symbol for it, and it looks like that. So you'll see that, and you just know that it means the word congruent. Kind of short and sweet, besides that kind of textbook definition that at least two sides are congruent, another way to think of it is if you see a triangle and the only thing marked up on it is that two angles are congruent, it's also isosceles. So I'm just going to draw a couple triangles. Let's say we have this triangle here, and we have it marked like that. Those are called tick marks. When the tick marks match on different sides, it means that those sides are equal. So if we have this picture staring us in the face, we can see there's two tick marks that match. So those two sides have to be equal to each other. So we know that it is isosceles. If we have another way that we could tell that we have an isosceles triangle is maybe we have a triangle like this, and they're showing that this angle here is congruent to that angle, and that's how they would mark it up. That's one way they can mark up congruent angles. So if you're looking at the red triangle and you see two angles marked up the way that I have it there, it's telling you those two angles are congruent, so you have to make the conclusion that that triangle is isosceles. So those are two different ways that we can have isosceles. And what we're going to work on a little bit in some of these problems is that if we have this triangle here, we need to be able to mark up which are the two angles that are equal. So if there's two sides that are equal, there has to be two angles that are equal. And conversely, in this triangle, if there's two angles that are equal, we have to be able to say that there's two sides that are equal or congruent. So let's talk about that just for a short second. In this first triangle here, we have two sides. Well, how do we know which angles are congruent? We can't just guess or assign them randomly. The tick marks of the sides are actually kind of pointing at the two angles that are congruent. So if you kind of trace those tick marks over, we can now mark up those congruent angles. All right, so it's not a matter of guessing, but it's actually the angles that are opposite those congruent sides. If we look at the red triangle, again, we were told that two angles are congruent, and if you kind of march across to the opposite sides, those are the sides that are congruent. So we legally can and probably should mark those two sides congruent. It's kind of just a habit. Unfortunately, isosceles triangles aren't always quote unquote right side up. Like this, I would call right side up. If you do see right side up, boom, you just go down here. They're called base angles. Mark those congruent. That's another way to show angles are congruent. So that's just kind of getting in the habit of being able to follow those tick marks across and then just saying, okay, it's pointing at the angles that are congruent. So that's something you're going to have to learn. It's not difficult per se. It's just a matter of training yourself and practicing it. Putting pen to paper is the best way. All right, let's move on to equilateral triangles. Equilateral triangles, all three sides are congruent. And by the way, you might want to pause this and just write down some of these things for notes. It certainly can't hurt. And informally, all three angles are congruent. So if we have a triangle here and it is marked like this, we know it's isosceles. If we have all three sides marked with that tick mark, it's also equilateral. Okay, so that is one way to tell right off the bat that you have an equilateral. Equi means equal, lateral means side. So if all three sides are equal, it's equilateral. Another way to tell, and I put that in parentheses up above, is that all angles are congruent. So if you have a triangle and it's marked like that, and all three angles are marked with the same quote-unquote tick mark, we right off the bat know that that all three angles are equal, and we also know that that means that all three sides have to be equal. All right. If we go back to our the first equilateral triangle I started talking about, we have the sides marked up. We could and probably should, if we're a good math student, mark up those angles as being congruent. And really, the only other thing I can think of saying before we move on to problems about equilateral triangles is each angle has to equal 60 degrees. Why is that? Well, one of the biggest properties we're going to use in the following problems is that the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. So if we have 180 degrees all together in one triangle and we have three equal pieces, when we divide 180 by 3, we get 60. All right, and again, I'm a big proponent. I'm always telling my students to mark up their pictures. And so that's something that I would definitely encourage you to do. All right, let's move to some problems. The top problem. Right off the bat, I have 3 congruent angles that are shown here, here, and here. So I know it's equilateral. So I know that all 3 sides are equal. So there's no real quote-unquote math to do. We're just using the logic of the diagram. X has to be 19 because all sides are equal. For this triangle here, I have 2 angles that are marked congruent, this one, and they are opposite the congruent sides. So again, almost no math to do. We're just using the logic behind the picture. So x has to be 10 in that triangle, and we have an isosceles triangle there. The bottom triangle here, we have tick marks, so I know first off the bat that it's isosceles. And then the tick marks are pointing to the 2 angles that are equal. So I can mark that up in my picture, and as I'm doing it, I'm processing the fact that, hey, those 2 are equal. So there's, again, no quote-unquote math to do. X is 47. Those are the 2 angles that are equal to each other. All right, last 2 problems. These are, there's just a little bit more thinking behind them, and these are the ones we're going to use the property that the angles of a triangle add up to 180. So the top triangle here, we have... we have 2 tick marks, so we know that it's isosceles. And the tick marks are pointing to the angles that are equal, so I'm marking those up. This angle here is x, so I'm marking that up as x. These are both x. So I know altogether there's 180. So I'm going to subtract out this 3rd angle, the one that's not congruent to anything. Whoops, that's the wrong number. I wanted a 4 there. 17 minus 9. So when I subtract out the 4, I subtract out the 96, I get 84. And this number of degrees is what's left over that has to get split between this angle and this angle. So I'm just going to divide that in 2. So 84 divided by 2 is 42. All right. So you take away, in this case, because 96 isn't one of the congruent ones, you take it away from 180, and whatever's left has to be split up between the 2 equal angles. All right, let's look at the bottom one. Again, we have an isosceles triangle, and the tick marks are pointing to the angles that are equal, so I'm marking that up. I'm going to put an X in this corner because those are equal to each other. The 76 is not one of the congruent triangles, so I'm going to take that away from the 180 total degrees. And let's see, that's going to be 104. And again, it's the 104 that has to be split between this one and this one equally because they're equal to each other. So if I take 104 and divide it by 2, I am going to get 52 degrees. All right, I hope that helped. Thank you.